On Thanksgiving night, in a quiet Georgia estate, a stranger walked in uninvited. He wasn't family, he wasn't a friend, but in his hand, he carried something from the Vietnam War, a small metal tag that didn't belong to him. It belonged to her husband, the man she had loved, the man she had trusted for over 40 years. And what that stranger said next didn't just question her marriage. It threatened to destroy everything her family had built, because some secrets don't stay buried forever. The air over the Georgia estate carried the slow warmth of late November, thick with the scent of pecan pie, roasted turkey, and wood smoke drifting lazily from the stone chimney, the kind of afternoon that felt suspended in time, where every detail seemed carefully preserved, as if the past itself had refused to leave. Evelyn Whitmore stood at the far end of the long dining table, her posture straight despite her 72 years, her silver hair pinned neatly into place, her hands resting lightly on the polished wood as she surveyed the room. Nothing escaped her notice, not the placement of the fine china, not the angle of the crystal glasses, not even the faint smudge on a serving spoon that one of the maids had overlooked. For 40 years, this house had been hers in every sense that mattered, not merely owned, but controlled, shaped, disciplined into something that reflected her will, her taste, her story. And her story, like everything else in this house, had been carefully constructed. Outside, the oak trees stretched wide and ancient, their leaves catching the golden light, while inside, the echoes of a different era lingered. Framed photographs of a younger Evelyn and her late husband, Charles Whitmore, hung along the walls, capturing moments that seemed effortless, natural, even joyful, though anyone who looked closely enough might have noticed the precision in those smiles, the careful distance in the way they stood beside one another, not quite touching, not quite separate. "Mother, do you want the candles lit now or after David arrives?" her daughter Caroline asked, her voice smooth but edged with the faint impatience of someone accustomed to waiting for approval. Evelyn did not turn immediately. She let the question hang in the air just long enough to remind Caroline that timing, like everything else in this house, belonged to her. "After," she said finally, her tone calm, decisive, leaving no room for interpretation. Caroline nodded, though the small tightening at the corner of her mouth did not escape Evelyn's attention. It never did, nothing ever did. In the adjacent room, a record played softly, the familiar crackle of vinyl carrying a tune that had once been popular in the late 70s, something Charles had favored, something that had remained in rotation long after his death, not out of sentimentality, but because it fit the image Evelyn had chosen to preserve. Charles Whitmore, decorated veteran, respected businessman, a man whose name still carried weight across the county and beyond, even years after he had been laid to rest beneath a white marble headstone that bore words carefully selected to say everything, and nothing at all. He would have liked this, her son Thomas said, appearing in the doorway, adjusting the cuff of his shirt as his eyes swept the room with quiet approval. Evelyn allowed herself the smallest smile. "He did like it," she replied, correcting him with a subtle emphasis that turned memory into certainty, as though the past were not something remembered, but something still under her control. Thomas nodded, though his gaze lingered briefly on one of the photographs, a younger version of himself standing stiffly beside his father, his expression uncertain, as if even then he had sensed something unspoken beneath the surface. "David's late," he said after a moment. Evelyn's fingers pressed slightly against the edge of the table, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for her to feel it. "David is always late," she said, her voice cool, dismissive, though the truth was more complicated. David had been late since the day he learned that time, like authority, could be resisted, bent, even ignored. "He said he was bringing someone," Caroline added, almost casually, though her eyes flicked toward Evelyn with a hint of curiosity. Evelyn turned her head then, slowly. "Someone?" she repeated. Caroline shrugged lightly. "He didn't say much, just someone he met." A pause followed, brief but significant. Evelyn considered this, weighing it not as a mother might, but as someone accustomed to assessing variables, potential disruptions, anything that might alter the careful balance of the evening. "Then we will meet them," she said at last, her tone neutral, though beneath it lay the quiet assertion that nothing, and no one, entered her domain without being measured. The sound of gravel crunching under tires broke the moment, a car pulling up the long driveway, the engine cutting off, doors opening, voices carrying faintly through the air. Evelyn straightened, smoothing an invisible crease from her dress, her expression settling into the composed calm she wore as naturally as breathing. "That will be him," Thomas said. "Of course it is," Evelyn replied. Footsteps approached the front door, slower than expected, uneven in a way that did not match David's usual careless stride. Evelyn noticed that immediately, and something within her sharpened, though her face revealed nothing. The door opened, and David stepped inside, his hair slightly disheveled, his smile uncertain. Behind him stood a man Evelyn had never seen before. The room seemed to narrow, the air tightening in a way no one else appeared to feel yet. The man was older, perhaps in his late 60s, his posture straight but not rigid, his clothes simple, worn in a way that spoke of use rather than neglect. In his hand, he held something small, wrapped carefully in cloth. "Mom," David said, his voice carrying a note Evelyn had not heard in years, hesitation. "This is Mr. Harris." Evelyn's gaze moved to the man, steady, unblinking. "You've come a long way to arrive unannounced," she said, not unkindly, but with a precision that turned observation into quiet challenge. The man inclined his head slightly. "Yes, ma'am," he said. His voice was calm, measured, carrying a weight that did not rely on volume. "I suppose I have." A silence followed, thin but growing. Caroline shifted slightly, Thomas frowned, David avoided looking directly at his mother. Evelyn took a single step forward. "And what is it that brings you here, Mr. Harris?" she asked. The man looked at her then, directly, without hesitation, and in that moment Evelyn felt something she had not felt in decades, not fear, not yet, but recognition, the faintest echo of something buried long ago. "I believe," he said slowly, "that I have something that belongs to your husband." The words landed softly, but their effect was immediate. Evelyn's fingers tightened, just for a fraction of a second. "My husband has been dead for 12 years, she replied. "Then perhaps," the man said, unwrapping the cloth in his hands with deliberate care, "it belongs to the truth he left behind." Inside the cloth was a small object, metal worn smooth by time, edges dulled but unmistakable, a military tag, engraved, marked, carrying the weight of another place, another time. Vietnam. The room fell completely silent. Evelyn stared at the object, her expression unchanged, though something deep beneath it shifted, cracked, threatened to surface. "Where did you get that?" she asked, her voice steady. The man held her gaze. "From a man who never made it home," he said. The words lingered, heavy, impossible to ignore. Evelyn felt the past rise, not as memory, but as something alive, something that had waited patiently for this exact moment. Around her, her children watched, confusion beginning to turn into something sharper, something closer to understanding. "You should leave," Thomas said suddenly, stepping forward, his tone firm. But the man did not move. "I didn't come to cause trouble," he said. "I came because some things don't stay buried forever." Evelyn exhaled slowly, the sound almost imperceptible. For 40 years, she had controlled the narrative, shaped the truth into something acceptable, something admirable, something that built a legacy. But now, standing in her own home, on the edge of a holiday meant to celebrate gratitude and family, she felt that narrative begin to slip. Not collapse. Not yet. But loosen, just enough to reveal the possibility of what lay beneath. She lifted her chin slightly, her voice regaining its full authority. "Then perhaps," she said, "you should explain yourself, before dinner is served." The man nodded once. And somewhere, far beneath the surface of Evelyn Whitmore's carefully constructed world, something long silent finally began to speak. "The dining room. Men come back from war with different things," he said finally, his tone calm, reflective, but edged with something deeper, something that refused to soften into politeness. "Some bring medals, some bring silence, and some bring things that were never meant to be carried home at all." David shifted where he stood, his unease now visible, his earlier hesitation hardening into something closer to dread. "What is this about?" he asked, looking between the two of them, his voice no longer casual, no longer detached. Evelyn did not look at him. She did not need to. "It is about your father," she said quietly, and in that quiet there was command. Thomas crossed his arms, his jaw tightening. "Then say it clearly," he said, his tone sharper now, protective but controlled, "because right now, this sounds like the beginning of an accusation." Mr. Harris lifted his eyes again, meeting Thomas's gaze without flinching. "It is not an accusation," he said. "It is a correction." The word lingered in the air, subtle yet precise, and Evelyn felt it land with a weight she could not dismiss. "Of what?" Caroline asked, her voice softer than before, though her eyes were fixed intently on the tag, as if it might reveal something if she stared long enough. Mr. Harris stepped forward, just enough to place the object gently on the table. The faint metallic sound it made against the wood seemed louder than it should have been, as though the room itself were amplifying its presence. "Charles Whitmore was not the man people believed he was," he said. Thomas let out a short breath, almost a laugh, but there was no humor in it. "That's a bold statement to make in his own home," he replied. "It's not bold," Mr. Harris said quietly. "It's late." Evelyn felt something tighten behind her ribs, not panic, not yet, but the unmistakable pressure of something long contained beginning to press outward. "You speak as though you were there," she said, her voice still controlled, still calm. "I was," Mr. Harris answered. The simplicity of it cut deeper than anything else. David frowned. "You served with him?" he asked. Mr. Harris nodded once. "Same unit," he said. "Same night." The room seemed to contract around those words. Evelyn's fingers brushed lightly against the edge of the table, grounding herself in something solid, something present, something she could still control. "And what happened that night?" she asked. Mr. Harris's gaze shifted briefly to the windows, where the last light of evening had begun to fade, then back to her. "There was an operation," he said slowly, choosing each word with care, one that didn't go the way it was supposed to. Thomas exhaled sharply. That describes half the war, he said. This was different, Mr. Harris replied. This was the kind of mistake that doesn't stay on the battlefield. Evelyn felt the past stir more violently now, fragments of conversations, of reports, of carefully constructed explanations rising in her mind like something trying to break through the surface. You're being deliberately vague, she said, her tone tightening slightly. No, Mr. Harris said. I'm being careful. A pause followed, long enough for the weight of that distinction to settle. Caroline stepped closer to the table, her eyes moving from the tag to her mother. Mom, she said quietly, did you know about any of this? Evelyn turned to her then, slowly, her expression composed, almost serene. Your father served his country, she said. That is what I know. Mr. Harris watched her, not interrupting, not challenging, simply observing in a way that made silence feel like pressure. And what he brought back, he added, helped build everything you see here. The implication was unmistakable now. David shook his head. No, he said under his breath. No, that doesn't make sense. Thomas looked at Mr. Harris, his eyes narrowing. Then explain it, he said. Completely. Mr. Harris nodded slightly, as if he had expected nothing less. There was a village, he said. Small, barely marked on the map. We were told it was a supply point, enemy presence confirmed. Evelyn felt her pulse slow, strangely, as if her body had chosen calm in the face of something it already recognized. Your father was in command of the patrol, Mr. Harris continued. Orders were given. Shots were fired. And by the time it was over, he stopped. The silence that followed was not empty, it was filled with everything he had not yet said. By the time it was over, what? David pressed. Mr. Harris looked at him. It wasn't a supply point, he said. It was civilians. The words settled heavily into the room. Caroline covered her mouth. Thomas stiffened. David took a step back, as if the space itself had shifted beneath him. Evelyn did not move. Not outwardly. But inside, something old and carefully sealed began to fracture. That was investigated, she said, her voice steady, almost automatic. There were reports. Findings. It was ruled a misidentification. Mr. Harris nodded. That's what the report said, he replied. And that's the story that followed him home. Thomas looked between them, confusion and disbelief mixing into something sharper. Are you saying the report was wrong? He asked. Mr. Harris didn't hesitate. I'm saying it wasn't the whole truth. Evelyn's eyes met his, and for the first time, there was something in them that had not been there before, not weakness, not fear, but the strain of holding something in place that no longer wanted to stay. And you believe, she said slowly, that coming here, now, changes that? Mr. Harris shook his head. No, he said. I believe it finishes it. The room fell silent again, but this silence was different. It was no longer uncertain, no longer confused, it was focused, sharp, like the edge of something about to break. David ran a hand through his hair, his voice unsteady. "What does this have to do with this?" he asked, gesturing toward the tag. Mr. Harris looked down at it briefly. "It belonged to a man who was there that night," he said. "A man who tried to stop what happened." Evelyn's breath caught, just slightly. Too slight for most to notice. But not for Mr. Harris. "And your father," he continued, his voice quieter now, "made sure that man never told his side of the story." The implication landed fully now. Not just a mistake. Not just a misidentification. Something else. Something deliberate. Thomas's voice dropped. "You're accusing him of covering it up." "I'm saying he had help," Mr. Harris replied, his eyes returning to Evelyn. The room shifted again, the focus narrowing, tightening, until there was no longer any distance left to hide behind. Evelyn felt it, the moment she had spent 40 years avoiding, arriving not with chaos, but with clarity. "That's enough," she said. Her voice was calm. Controlled. But final. Everyone turned to her. "Dinner will be served," she continued, as though nothing had happened, as though the past had not just stepped into the present and taken a seat at her table. The decision hung there, deliberate, unmistakable. Not denial. Not acceptance. Control. Always control. Mr. Harris studied her for a long moment, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Of course," he said. And as the first dishes were brought in, as chairs were pulled out and the ritual of Thanksgiving resumed with quiet precision, the truth did not disappear. It remained there, between them, unspoken now but no less present, waiting, patient, certain that this time, it would not be buried again. Dinner was served exactly as it had been every Thanksgiving for decades, the same dishes, the same order, the same quiet choreography that had once made the evening feel predictable, safe, almost ceremonial, yet tonight every movement carried a weight that no one could ignore, as though the ritual itself were struggling to hold together under the pressure of something far more powerful than tradition. Evelyn took her seat at the head of the table, her posture as composed as ever, her hands resting lightly beside her plate, and for a moment, just a moment, it almost seemed as if she had succeeded in restoring order, as if the intrusion, the story, the implications could be folded neatly away like a misplaced detail. But the silence gave it away, not the peaceful silence of familiarity, but something tighter, sharper, the kind that listens, that waits, that refuses to be dismissed. "Please," Evelyn said calmly, her voice guiding the room back into motion, "let's not allow speculation to ruin what should be a pleasant evening." The words were measured, reasonable, even gentle, yet beneath them lay something unmistakable, a quiet insistence that the evening would proceed on her terms, as it always had. Plates were passed, utensils lifted, but no one began eating immediately. David was the first to break. "A pleasant evening," he repeated, his voice low, almost disbelieving, "after what we just heard?" Evelyn did not look at him. Instead, she reached for the serving spoon, placing a portion of turkey onto her plate with deliberate care. "What we heard," she said, "was a story, told by a stranger, about events that occurred nearly 50 years ago, in circumstances none of us here fully understand." He said he was there, Caroline replied quietly, her eyes fixed on her mother. Evelyn nodded slightly. So he claims. Mr. Harris, seated at the far end of the table, did not react to the dismissal. He simply watched, his presence alone enough to keep the tension alive. Thomas leaned forward, his tone controlled but firm. Mother, this isn't something you can just manage, he said. It's already here. Evelyn finally lifted her gaze, meeting his. Everything is manageable, she replied. If one remains clear-headed. The exchange hung in the air, a subtle clash of authority that no longer felt one-sided. No, Caroline shifted slightly, her voice softer but edged with something new. Clear-headed, she repeated, or selective? The question was small, almost quiet, but it cut deeper than any raised voice could have. Evelyn's expression did not change, but there was a pause, just long enough to acknowledge that the line had been crossed. You are tired, she said evenly. And perhaps more influenced by tonight's unexpected guest than you realize. Don't do that, David said sharply. Evelyn turned her attention to him now, fully. Do what? She asked. Make it sound like we're the ones overreacting, he said. Like this is just confusion. A brief silence followed. Then Evelyn set down her fork. Very well, she said, her tone shifting almost imperceptibly, the softness giving way to something firmer, something closer to truth. What is it you believe you have heard? David hesitated, as though the act of saying it aloud would make it real in a way he was not yet ready to accept. That Dad wasn't just part of something, he said slowly, but that he controlled it, shaped it, and then buried it. The words landed heavily, each one carrying more weight than the last. Evelyn studied him. And you accept that, she said, based on the testimony of a man you met less than an hour ago? It's not just that, Caroline said quietly. It's the way you're responding. Evelyn's gaze shifted to her. And how is that? Like you already knew, Caroline replied. The room stilled completely. Even Mr. Harris leaned forward slightly, his attention sharpening. Evelyn did not answer immediately. Instead, she reached for her glass, taking a slow sip of water, her movements as controlled as ever, yet now every second of silence stretched the tension tighter. Knowledge, she said at last, is rarely as simple as people wish it to be. Thomas frowned. That's not an answer. It is the only answer that matters, Evelyn replied. Because what you are asking is not whether something happened, she continued, her voice steady, deliberate, but whether I chose how it would be understood. No one spoke. The shift was unmistakable now. She was no longer deflecting. She was defining. David leaned forward, his voice lower, more intense. Did you? He asked. Evelyn met his gaze. Yes, she said. The word fell into the room like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through everything that had once seemed solid. Caroline's breath caught. Thomas sat back slightly, absorbing it. David stared at her, searching her face for something, regret, doubt, anything that might soften the impact. There was none. You helped him cover it up, Thomas said quietly. I helped preserve what needed to be preserved, Evelyn replied. That's not the same thing. It sounds exactly the same, David said. No, Evelyn said, her tone sharpening now, it sounds simpler. Which is why you prefer it. Mr. Harris watched her closely, his expression unreadable, as though he had been waiting for this moment, not to expose her, but to hear her speak without the protection of silence. Do you know what happens, Evelyn continued, her voice gaining a quiet intensity, when a man returns from war with something that can destroy everything he has built? No one answered. He is not the only one who suffers, she said. His family suffers. His children suffer. His future disappears before it has even begun. And what about the people who are already gone? Caroline asked softly, tears forming in her eyes. Evelyn paused. Just for a moment. They were already beyond suffering, she said. The cold clarity of the statement stunned the room into silence. David stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. I can't sit here and listen to this, he said. Evelyn looked at him, her expression unreadable. And yet you have, she replied. All your life. The words hit harder than anything else she had said. David froze, the truth in them impossible to ignore. Thomas ran a hand over his face, his voice quieter now. So everything, the business, the reputation, all of it. Evelyn nodded once. Was protected, she said. Carefully. Consistently. Successfully. Mr. Harris finally spoke again, his voice calm but firm. Until now. Evelyn turned to him. Nothing is undone yet, she said. Not unless I allow it to be. The statement hung in the air, bold, unmistakable. A declaration of control. A refusal to yield. The plates remained half full, something else lingered, food untouched, something quieter, the ritual of Thanksgiving reduced to something hollow, not fully a performance that no longer convinced anyone at the first time in 40 years. The warmth that once defined the evening had vanished entirely, replaced by a tension so dense it seemed to settle into the walls themselves. It could not be returned to silence, leaving no space for comfort, no space for escape. Evelyn sat exactly as she had before, her posture composed, her expression unreadable, yet something beneath that stillness had shifted, not visibly, not in a way her children could easily name, but enough that the balance she had maintained for decades no longer felt absolute. David remained standing, his breathing uneven, his anger no longer sharp but heavy, weighed down by something closer to realization than outrage. You don't even hear yourself, he said finally, his voice low, strained. You're talking about people's lives like they were variables. Evelyn did not flinch. Because that is what they became, she replied. Once the event had already occurred, the only thing left was consequence. And consequence can be managed. Managed, Caroline repeated, her voice breaking slightly. You keep saying that word like it justifies something. Evelyn turned to her slowly. It doesn't justify, she said. It ensures survival. Thomas exhaled sharply, leaning forward with his hands pressed against the table. Survival for who? He asked. For us? Evelyn held his gaze. Yes, she said simply. The honesty of it landed harder than any denial could have. Silence followed, but it was no longer uncertain, it was filled with something clearer now, something that had been forming since the moment Mr. Harris walked through the door. Understanding. Not acceptance. Not forgiveness. But the undeniable recognition of who their mother truly was. Mr. Harris shifted slightly in his chair, his presence no longer that of an outsider but something closer to a witness, someone who had carried a version of this truth for decades and was now watching it unfold in real time. There was another report, he said quietly. All eyes turned to him. Evelyn did not move, but something in her attention sharpened instantly. Unofficial, he continued. Never filed. Never recorded. But written. Thomas frowned. By who? Mr. Harris met Evelyn's gaze before answering. By the man who tried to stop it. The implication settled immediately. The tag on the table. The man who never came home. Evelyn's fingers pressed lightly against the edge of her plate, her control still intact, but no longer effortless. And where is this report now? She asked. Mr. Harris did not look away. With someone who believes it should finally be seen. David let out a quiet, disbelieving breath. You mean this isn't just a story, he said. This is evidence. Mr. Harris nodded once. It always was. Caroline looked between them, her voice trembling. If that comes out. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. The name Whitmore. The estate. The business. Everything built over 40 years. It would not just crack. It would collapse. Thomas straightened slowly, the weight of it settling over him. This isn't just about the past, he said. This is about everything that exists now because of it. Evelyn watched him carefully. Now you understand, she said. David turned to her, anger rising again, but different now, deeper, more controlled. No, he said. Now I see the cost. A long silence followed. Then Evelyn spoke, her voice quieter than before, but no less steady. Every life has a cost, she said. Most people simply never see the full account. Mr. Harris leaned forward slightly. Some of us do, he said. And we carry it whether we want to or not. Evelyn met his gaze, and for the first time, there was no dismissal in her expression, no attempt to diminish what he represented. Only recognition. And what is it you want? She asked. Justice? Mr. Harris shook his head slowly. Justice doesn't come this late, he said. Not the kind people imagine. Then what? Evelyn pressed. He paused, considering his answer. The truth, he said. Spoken. Not managed. The distinction hung between them, sharp and undeniable. Evelyn leaned back slightly, her hands folding together in her lap, her posture still composed, still dignified, yet something in her presence had shifted from control to calculation, not of how to contain the truth, but of what would happen if she did not. And if I refuse? She asked. Mr. Harris did not hesitate. Then someone else will speak it, he said. Soon. The word lingered. Not a threat. Not quite. But a certainty. Caroline shook her head, her voice breaking. This will destroy us, she said. Evelyn turned to her. No, she said quietly. It will reveal us. David looked at his mother, really looked at her, as though seeing her for the first time. And you're willing to let that happen? He asked. Evelyn did not answer immediately. The room held still, every second stretching, waiting. Finally, she spoke. For 40 years, she said slowly, I have ensured that this family stood on solid ground. She paused, her gaze moving from one child to the other. But solid ground, she continued, is not always the same as honest ground. The admission was subtle, but it changed everything. Thomas's voice softened, just slightly. Then what are you saying? He asked. Evelyn looked down at the table, at the tag, at the place where the past had finally forced its way into the present. When she looked up again, there was something different in her eyes. Not weakness. Not surrender. But the beginning of something else. I am saying, she replied, that control has its limits. The room fell silent once more. And in that silence, something shifted, not outside, not yet, but within Evelyn herself, in a place she had kept sealed for decades. Because for the first time, the choice before her was not how to protect what had been built. It was whether it deserved to remain standing at all. The night had settled fully over the Georgia estate, heavy and still, the last traces of daylight swallowed by a sky that offered no stars, only a quiet darkness that seemed to press gently against the windows. Inside, the house no longer carried the rhythm of a celebration, but something slower, more deliberate, as though every moment were being measured against what had already been said and what could no longer be undone. The guests had gone, dismissed early with polite words and practiced composure, the kind Evelyn had perfected over a lifetime. None of them knew, not truly, though some had sensed the shift, the subtle fracture beneath the surface of an evening that was meant to honor gratitude in continuity. Now, only the family remained, and the man who had brought the past with him. Evelyn stood alone in the drawing room for a long time, her reflection faint in the dark glass, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, yet beneath that calm something unfamiliar had taken hold, not panic, not regret in the way others might define it, but a quiet awareness that the structure she had maintained for 40 years was no longer hers to control entirely. Behind her, she could hear the low murmur of voices, David and Thomas speaking in restrained tones, Caroline moving softly through the house, each of them carrying their own version of what the night had revealed. She had always believed that strength meant deciding which truths mattered and which did not, that survival, dignity, legacy, these were things that required shaping, guiding, sometimes even protecting from the full weight of reality. But now, standing in the dim light, she understood something she had resisted for decades, that control and truth could not occupy the same space forever. Footsteps approached, slow, deliberate. She did not turn immediately, because she already knew who it was. "They're waiting," Mr. Harris said quietly from the doorway. Evelyn closed her eyes for a brief moment, then opened them. "Of course they are," she replied. She turned then, moving past him with the same measured grace she had carried into every room of this house for 40 years, yet tonight each step felt different, not heavier, but more certain, as though the direction had finally been chosen, even if the outcome had not. When she entered the dining room again, her children looked up, their expressions tense, uncertain, searching. The table remained as it had been left, the remnants of dinner untouched, the small metal tag still resting at its center like a quiet, immovable truth. Evelyn did not sit immediately. Instead, she stood at the head of the table, her place, the position she had always occupied, not just physically, but in every decision, every silence, every carefully constructed version of their lives. "I have spent a great deal of time," she began, her voice steady, carrying easily through the room, "believing that what I did was necessary." No one interrupted. "Not this time. Your father came home from a war that did not end when he left it," she continued. "He brought back something that could have destroyed him, and by extension, all of us." Her gaze moved slowly from Thomas to Caroline to David. "I made a choice," she said. "Not once, but repeatedly. To protect him. To protect you. To protect what we could still build." David's jaw tightened, but he did not speak. "And in doing so," Evelyn went on, "I decided what version of the truth would survive." The admission settled into the room, not as a shock this time, but as confirmation. Thomas leaned forward slightly. "And now?" he asked. Evelyn looked at him. "Now," she said, "I must decide whether that version deserves to continue." Silence followed, deep and expectant. Caroline's voice came softly, fragile but clear. "Do you regret it?" she asked. The question lingered longer than any other had that night. Evelyn did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked down at the table, at the tag, at the faint scratches in the wood that had been there for years, unnoticed, unimportant, until now. "Regret," she said slowly, "is a luxury that belongs to people who believe they had a different choice." She lifted her gaze again. "I did not believe that," she said. "But I was wrong." The words were quiet, but they changed something fundamental in the room. David exhaled, the tension in him shifting, not gone, but altered. "So what happens now?" he asked. Evelyn turned slightly, her eyes settling on Mr. Harris, who had remained near the doorway, silent, patient, as though he had already accepted whatever outcome might come. "You said the report still exists," she said. Mr. Harris nodded once. "It does. And if it is brought forward," she continued, "everything connected to my husband's name will be questioned." "Yes," he said. Evelyn considered that, not as a possibility, but as a certainty. The estate. The business. The legacy. The image she had preserved with such precision. All of it would shift, perhaps collapse, perhaps be redefined in ways she could not control. She took a slow breath. "Then it should be brought forward," she said. The words were not loud. Not dramatic. But they carried the weight of finality. Caroline's eyes filled with tears. Thomas closed his eyes briefly. David stared at her, searching, as if still unsure he had heard correctly. "You're choosing this?" he asked. Evelyn met his gaze. "No," she said. "I am no longer choosing against it." The distinction mattered more than any of them could fully grasp yet. Mr. Harris stepped forward slightly, his expression unreadable, though something in his posture eased, just enough to suggest that the burden he had carried was no longer his alone. "Then it will be done," he said. Evelyn nodded. "Yes," she replied. A long silence followed, but it was no longer the same silence that had filled the house earlier. It was not suffocating, not tense, but something quieter, more open, as though space had finally been made for something that had been waiting for decades. Evelyn reached out, her fingers brushing lightly against the metal tag, then closing around it. It felt heavier than it should have, not because of its size, but because of everything it represented, everything it had carried across time, across silence, across decisions that could no longer be undone. She held it for a moment, then placed it back down gently. "Your father will be remembered differently," she said. "So will I." No one argued. No one tried to soften it. Because there was nothing to soften. Only truth. And the cost that came with it. Evelyn straightened slightly, her posture still strong, still composed, but no longer guarded in the same way. For the first time in 40 years, she was not holding something back. She was letting it stand. "We will face what comes," she said. "Together, if you choose to remain. Separately, if you do not." The offer was simple. Honest. Perhaps the first truly honest thing she had given them in a very long time. David looked at his siblings, then back at his mother, and though the anger had not disappeared, something else had begun to take its place, something quieter, more complex. "We'll see it through," he said finally. Thomas nodded slowly. Caroline wiped her eyes. Outside, the wind moved gently through the trees, no longer threatening, no longer building toward a storm, but settling into something calmer, something steady. Evelyn turned toward the window once more, her reflection clearer now in the glass, not because the light had changed, but because she had. 40 years had built a life. One decision had changed its meaning. But as she stood there, she understood something that had eluded her for most of that time: the truth, once spoken, does not destroy everything. It simply reveals what was strong enough to remain. And for the first time in decades, she felt something she had never allowed herself before. Not control. Not certainty. But peace.